Hey everyone, welcome back to Nurse Crit. My name is Chasen. I'm an acute care nurse practitioner. From a night shift peeps, have you ever called a doctor in the middle of the night and received a less than pleasant response? I know I have, and I used to wonder why doctors have to be such jerks. Well, as a nurse practitioner, I am in a unique position to see things from both sides. I used to be the caller for many years, and now I'm the callee. And let me just say, I can kind of understand why some doctors are not very nice at times. My goal for this video is to let you know some of the things that make me shake my head as a provider and how you can do better when contacting physicians or other NPs, especially during the night. The objective for this video is to help nurses understand ways to improve their physician notification skills at night, learning about the who, what, when, and how. I was a night shift staff nurse for over a decade. One of my many skills was learning the art of physician notification. I prided myself on knowing exactly when to notify the physician during the night and when something could wait until the morning. Now, I understand that this skill is completely dependent on your work situation. If you work at an academic center with tons of doctors or trainees who are always in-house, then the expectations of your practice will be very different than mine was. I worked in a community hospital without residents or students, and I corresponded with attendings every time. Although it is technically their job to take call at night, they are still human, and it can be somewhat detrimental to be constantly calling them all night long when they still have to come back to work the next morning. But regardless of your particular work setting, it is still incumbent on nurses to learn the preferences of their physicians. Medicine is highly specialized, and you will work in a department that deals with certain physicians more than others. I worked in a surgical specialty, and I knew which surgeon wanted to manage issues himself and which ones preferred their medicine consultants to intervene. Having that professional understanding is how you improve physician-nurse relations and ultimately the productivity and morale of the unit. Unless you have a physician that explicitly states otherwise, the majority of them prefer the no news is good news philosophy. If there are no significant changes overnight, then you do not have to update the provider. Only if there is a change in clinical status, or if you need something to be acted on, then you absolutely must contact a provider. It's generally considered inappropriate to call an attending in the wee hours for something minor like colace. If you are a newer nurse, one of my suggestions is that you consult with an experienced charge nurse before calling a doc. When I was in charge of my unit, I insisted that all new grads go through me before calling the surgeon to make sure it was an appropriate call. Obviously, I did not have the authority to override a nurse who felt legally compelled to call a physician, but I was able to defer some unimportant calls, and it did help those nurses to develop better discretion. As a nurse, I understand that at night, it's very much a damned if you do, damned if you don't, and it's always better to get in trouble for doing rather than not doing. But there are definitely some calls or messages that are largely unnecessary and can end up making you appear less competent. To help you all out, I have created a list of 10 mistakes that nurses can avoid doing at night to improve their credibility and relationship with their medical colleagues. I imagine I'm more prone to unnecessary messages than physicians because the nurses know I'm in-house and readily available. These mistakes are my own opinion. Do what you want with the information. In no particular order, here are the mistakes to avoid frustrating a provider at night. Mistake number 1, contacting the wrong provider. The first common mistake that happens way more often than it should is contacting the wrong provider. I understand that sometimes it's not as clear as it should be, but that should be a rare occurrence. I get messaged about a patient I am not following almost once a month. At my job, I am awake and in-house for my entire shift, so this is hardly an inconvenience for me. But if you're waking up a sleeping doctor at 2 a.m. for the wrong patient, I think their frustration and anger is justified. Remember to browse the progress notes from the day and make sure there is a note from the doctor you are contacting or from another doctor in the same physician group. And it should go without saying, make sure the issue you are calling for is related to the specialty you are calling. For example, if cardiology is following a patient, Don't call internal medicine for a heart problem just because they might be easier to get a hold of. Mistake number 2, not following text etiquette. For hospitals that utilize some form of text messaging system, which I believe is most hospitals, there is texting etiquette that you should follow. If it doesn't automatically do it, make sure to provide the patient's name, room number, and some other identifier like date of birth or medical record number. Please use SBAR format and keep your message concise, but include the most relevant details. Sleepy docs won't read a long-winded paragraph. They have admitted as such. Once you get your response from the doc, there is no need to send back an okay or thank you unless you do it within like a couple of seconds. Many docs will try to go back to sleep and will be incredibly annoyed if you wake them up again 5 minutes later saying thank you. Mistake number 3, not reviewing the chart before asking a question. This common mistake is definitely annoying to a provider. Please don't ask me or a doctor a question without first reviewing the chart. Many times I get asked for a PRN medication that is already ordered, or for vital sign parameters that are listed in a separate order, or for clarification of the plan that's clearly stated in the progress note. As a night shift NP, I don't know all the details of every single patient. I too have to scour the chart, and most times the information is right there if you had just looked first. It only makes you seem lazy if you didn't do your due diligence first before calling. My job is to problem solve, not read the notes for you. Mistake number 4, not documenting data in a timely manner. When you call a provider with an abnormal or critical value, please ensure that value is entered in the chart first. It's frustrating when I'm notified that a patient is hypotensive, but there isn't a single BP reading in the chart that shows me that. Or if the patient is in AFib RVR, but all the documented heart rates are only in the 80s and 90s. Or you call with a critical lab value before the result is uploaded into the system. As soon as I am notified of an issue, I immediately open up the patient's chart to see what's going on and gather as much information as possible to help guide my decision making. Or sometimes I'm just chart checking to follow up on something, but I have to wait hours for the nurse to document the info I'm looking for. Please help me to help you by inputting your data in real time. Mistake number 5, contacting the provider without a good reason. That is, when you call with nothing new to report. The next few mistakes that nurses make involve a lack of critical thinking. When you wake up a doc in the middle of the night, please make sure it's for a good reason. Sometimes nurses call or message with irrelevant information. I once received a message saying the hemoglobin is 7.6, down from 7.7. I appreciate that nurse recognized it's an abnormal value, but it has been low for days, and those two values are essentially the same. When all the vital signs are stable and there is no obvious indication of bleeding, that result shows no change, and therefore physician notification is not needed in the middle of the night. Similarly, I have known nurses to contact nephrology at night for a low urine output, even though it was a known problem throughout the day with a treatment plan already in place. Mistake number 6, contacting the provider too soon or too late. The timing of a notification has been a problem at times. Sometimes nurses jump the gun and try to notify me prematurely before there's even a problem, and other times they let me know way too late. For example, I have received messages that a patient's urine output was 28 mLs the last hour. Well, that's not actually a problem yet. A single value isn't a trend. Most of the time, the urine output is back to normal in the next hour. Obviously, it depends on the preference of your physicians, but I would probably suggest waiting 3 or 4 hours before you call a doctor about a low urine output. Unless it's 0 mLs and confirmed by a bladder scan, then maybe you can call after 2 hours or so. That's an example of calling way too soon. Now I will give an example of calling way too late. A couple of times, I got a message asking me if I wanted to give replacement potassium. Well, when I tried searching for the low potassium value, one time it was from 14 hours earlier, and another time it was 36 hours earlier. Yeah, come on now. That ship has sailed. I truly commend those nurses who were diligent enough to review the chart and catch that oversight, but it's just way too late. By that point, no one will likely even notice it was missed. But calling about it now will only bring more attention to the fact that it was missed. If it isn't causing problems, just wait for the next morning's labs. Mistake number 7. Contacting the provider for something that can wait until the morning. One of the hallmarks of a good nurse is their ability to safely improvise. As a nurse, I didn't need to be micromanaged by a physician. I could figure things out for myself. I once witnessed a nurse who called a cardiologist at night asking for holding parameters for the beta blocker. I almost pooped in my pants. I don't understand why the nurse couldn't exercise their nursing judgment for one instance and wait for the morning shift to ask for holding parameters. You have a nursing license for a reason, to prove you have the ability to think and exercise sound judgment. That nurse, sadly, demonstrated they had neither. One time, a nurse messaged me asking if they should make the patient NPO for a possible procedure in the morning. If I was the nurse, I would have just done it. No need to ask. It's well within your ability to withhold oral intake for a few hours overnight. I think it's unnecessary to call a provider for something that's already within your scope and won't harm the patient. Were those nurses wrong for contacting a provider overnight? Of course not. But it just simply wasn't necessary. If something is not urgent and you can improvise until the morning without doing anything that would be considered malpractice, then just handle it. The physician will thank you. Mistake number 8. Contacting the provider for nursing-specific issues. One of the more interesting calls I received as an NP was when a nurse asked me to come troubleshoot their arterial line. This one really surprised me. I assume they asked me because I am still technically a nurse. I was flattered they asked me, but I also felt it was an inappropriate request. Troubleshooting an A line is a nursing function. And let me be clear, I am not saying I am above nursing tasks, but I think that particular nurse should have followed the chain of command. They didn't even ask any of their peers or charge nurse for help first. As a nurse, I never would have asked a physician to perform a nursing task. It makes me wonder, if there wasn't an NP around, would the nurse have called a surgeon at night to come in and troubleshoot the A line? I can't even imagine how a physician would respond to such a phone call. Mistake number 9, sending FYI messages just to legally cover your butt. Quite often, I receive an FYI message towards the end of my shift. Sometimes it's important information, sometimes it isn't. I feel like nurses send me these messages just so they can document they let a provider know about something that might be important, but they aren't too sure. The irony of these FYI type of messages is that if it wasn't that important, it probably could have just waited until the primary team arrives in the morning. Or if it was something a little more important, I probably should have been notified in the moment, not as I'm heading out the door. Basically, if it's important enough to mention at all, it's probably important enough to tell me immediately. One time, a nurse gave me an FYI message towards the end of my shift, letting me know that they held the insulin because the patient was NPO and the blood sugar was 160. I was actually kind of upset about this. If the nurse made a judgment call to hold the insulin, I would have respected that decision. But don't exercise your nursing judgment and then try to shift the liability onto someone else. If you make a nursing judgment, you need to take responsibility for your actions. If that liability makes you uncomfortable, then you ask the provider to make that decision for you. Had the nurse asked me in the moment, I actually would have said to give the insulin. So that nurse basically wanted to share the liability, even though I had no say in the matter. We all need to be accountable for our own decisions and actions and try not to throw each other under the bus. Mistake number 10. Copy and pasting the provider's response directly into the EMR. This last one is a pet peeve of mine. I'm not sure where this became a regular practice for nurses. Yes, We do encourage direct quotes when a patient tells us information, but I don't ever remember being taught to quote a physician in nursing school. When I, as an NP, have a text conversation with a nurse, I expect them to paraphrase my response, just like they would have to paraphrase my response from a phone conversation. Parts of my response are meant as a personal communication between me and the nurse and not intended to be copied verbatim. Remember, the patient always has access to their own records. You need to selectively document and only include the relevant points while omitting any verbiage that could be perceived as unprofessional. I am obviously not a lawyer, but I imagine copying and pasting is akin to disclosing a private conversation without consent, which is no bueno. Please just learn how to properly document and get good at it. None of the examples I have listed are meant to humiliate or ridicule any nurse. We all have different nursing backgrounds and skill levels, and we are all constantly learning how to improve our practices. I am not discouraging nurses from contacting me or any other provider. This is a teaching video that was intended to offer insight from real-world experiences on how to avoid frustrating their physician colleagues unnecessarily. When you are recognized as a nurse who always calls for a good reason and never for silly things, you eventually gain the confidence and respect of the physicians. Understanding things from the perspective of the other side is how we learn to get along as a healthcare team. And while I'm helping team members see things from the other perspective, if I have any physician viewers, allow me to address you as well. First off, most nurses do not intentionally try to annoy you. Like I mentioned earlier in the video, night shift nurses are often caught between a rock and a hard place. They call, they get in trouble. They don't call, they get in trouble. And every physician has different preferences. When a nurse calls you, it's because in their judgment, it was important. But if their judgment was poor and you felt the call was unnecessary, teach them why you considered it unnecessary so they won't make that mistake again. Nurses frequently share their experiences with their peers so others don't also make that mistake. Thanks for sticking around to the end. So, did any of these examples seem like the nurse maybe contacted the provider unnecessarily? Or do you feel like every instance was totally justified? Let me know what you think in the comments. If you enjoyed this video, please like it and share it with your nurse friends and consider subscribing to my channel. It's the only way it will grow and reach a wider audience. I appreciate your support and look forward to sharing more nursing content with you in my next video.